Hi everybody. In this lesson we're starting chapter 32 of Shelmerdine's text. So we're on page 221 and we're introducing the second or the strong perfect active. So what we're talking about here with this number and second is the same thing that we've already had with the aorist. These are certain categories within these verb tenses, and we've seen the weak aorist most commonly in elusa. This is our first person singular form. I'm in perfect mode now. Simply I loosened or I freed. And we said that this was weak because of two things. It had this weak aorist marker, this sigma, and then it had our alpha-based endings. Alpha was our thematic vowel in this, so we had as, and then the third person we would have an epsilon, but then we had amen and ate, all these things. This was in contrast to our strong aorist, which let's take the form of patho. We learned a few of these strong aorists, but patho was one, to persuade, and then I persuaded was epithon. So we had a few things. We still had a past indicative augment, but note that we had a vowel change. A linguistic term for this is ablaut from the German. It's a kind of changing of sound. This shortened. The ending, our kind of consonant within the verb, the theta, remained, but we no longer had this kind of characteristic A alpha ending. We did not have this sigma here, and this made it a strong aorist. And these terms have associations. Weak seems worse than strong, but that's not really what we're talking about. Weak are more common. Strong are less common, are often verbs that are used more frequently. There's always a correlation between regularity and frequency, a negative correlation. As something becomes more frequent in a language, it's often going to become less regular. So regularity, and this is why verbs like to be are always pretty irregular because they're pretty irregular because they're very infrequent. Very frequent. My chart screwed me up here, but as frequency increases, the regularity will often decrease. That's the point. Let's remove the chart and return to our verb in question. So we've done weak and strong aorist at this point. Now let's talk about weak and strong perfect. Well, the weak perfect is again what we've already learned, leluca. And again, we're talking about the active here rather than the passive. So we saw a few things here. We had reduplication. We had the verb stem, the lu, the kind of, home of the loosening kind of concept. And then we had this kappa that we added, and we had this alpha ending. This is how we defined the weak perfect. Now on page 221, Shelmerdine is introducing the strong perfect. So let's take the kind of closely related verb. This is what she uses, and there's a number of typos on this page, so I want to bring those to bear. But leloipa, and then you have to see here, what is this verb coming from? Well, it's coming from lepo, to leave, as in leave behind, although leave behind is often apolepo. But we note a couple things here. We've maintained the verbal consonant. As the theta remained here and wasn't replaced by a sigma, here the pi, the p, remains and returns here. We've also had this ablaut, this vowel shift on the inside. We've gone from lepo to loip. So we've had that change. But then the thing to note here, which is nice about the perfect, is even in the strong perfect, we're not going to get these omicron epsilon thematic vowels. We're going to stay with alpha. So again, it's just a lot like the aorist. As, or I should say the weak aorist. As, with a new movable. And then in the plural, we've got amen, ate, and then finally asi. And note that these are all primary endings because we're talking about a primary tense here, the perfect. We've yet to get to the pluperfect in all of this. So let me break down this chart. This is what Shelmerdine has on page 221, but it's worth writing out our own version, first, second, third person. This is all singular. And let's do it again in the plural, first, second, third, plural. And then we'll have the working from the stem, which in this case is leloip. And then we'll be adding our personal endings, and then we'll approach the translation, and then repeat the personal endings. So the endings we just had right up here, let's replay those in a larger form. As, and that's a short alpha. Both of these are short alphas. Then an epsilon with a new movable, amen, ate, and asi. Note that the accent will fall there, and these are both short alphas here as we continue on. So we can just then put, these endings, as, amen, ate, asi, or sin. I guess I should be equal with those new movables, and then on top of the stem, leloip, leloipa, leloipas. Again, because those are both short alphas, the accent could fall back on the antepenult. And then leloipen. Leloipamen, now we're going to see, with all of that disyllabic ending, we'll need to take the accent there on the diphthong, leloipamen. Leloipate, and then in the third person plural, leloipase. So the translation, and this was what Shelmerdine screws up. Shelmerdine translates as if this verb is luo, but it's not. It's not luo at all. It's lepo. So it's leave. So this is I have left. And remember that this is the difference between the perfect and the aorist, which was simply I left. We would remove the have, is the sense of this is I have left the keys, under the house key under the potted plant out front, with the result that it's still there and it's there for you. If we just say I left the key out front, then you would say, well, you left it then, but is it still there? What's the connection to the present? I have left. That's the idea of the perfect tense in Greek. So then this is simply you have left, and then in the third person, he, she, it. Let me do it this way. Let me just start over on that. Actually, that was a mess. He, she, it has left. And then, so, I mean, you've gotten used to this now. In English, we're just conjugating the helping verb. That's how we do the perfect in English. Greek is actually just has a full tense and a full morphology for this perfect. So then, we have left, y'all have left, and then they have left. So that's it for the morphology. It's really not too bad. I want to go over, because Shelmerdine doesn't explain this too well, some of the examples she gives and what's going on here. So she gives the example akuo, which we know from, I don't even know, chapter 5. It's a really long time back now. I hear. And then we have in the perfect, ake koa. So again, because this is a short alpha, we know where the accent will fall on that eta. So what do we have here? It almost looks like reduplication, but what we've had is just a kind of stem change. So the ak is staying the same, but we're noting that here we're getting something different, ake. And then we used to, in the perfect, have things ending in kappa, alpha, sigma. This was our weak perfect. But note here, though we have a kappa, we've got this omicron here. That's actually the end of the stem. So we have oa, oas, oe. This is what we're going to be expecting. So why is this a strong perfect? Well, because it doesn't end in a kappa. And why does it end in an omicron? Well, there's no way to know or predict that. You have to look at the principal parts, and that's why the principal parts are always a pain, but they're necessary. But that's why this is, even though this has a kappa, this is being called a strong perfect because that kappa is not directly before the ends. Now this one's interesting too. We have bino, she gives us, and then we get the perfect bebeka. Again, short alpha, so the accent falls here. Here you say, well, Al, you just said kappa is the mark of the weak aorist. How are you putting, sorry, weak perfect. How are we putting this under the strong perfect? Well, here it's because we've had, again, change within the kind of verbal core. This wasn't predictable. With something like leluca, it was fairly predictable. We reduplicated, and then we stuck on the ending. Here we reduplicate, but it's not bebeika, it's bebeka. So it's the fact that we've had ablaut, that this alpha iota diphthong has become an eta, that we classify this as a strong. But this is, I mean, this is a pretty contentious case, right? That's pretty close. Something that will definitely seem strong to you is her third example, lambano. And then here you would expect, if we were going to reduplicate, we'd have lelamba beka or baka or something like that, banka, but no, here what we end up getting is ale lefa. You say, well, where the heck did that come from? We're going to see a lot of different endings here in the strong. Often, a number of them will be aspirated like this. So lambano is just very irregular. This is coming from a different verb, ultimately, kind of in the evolution of the language, but it means the same thing and has fallen in as the fourth principal part, elefa. But this is definitely a strong perfect, because look at that, it's not ending with a kappa, and we've had a significant change to the actual structure of the verb. The last thing that we'll cover in this little lesson is the idea that some tenses, and we've already seen this with the perfect and the aorist of some verbs, will have two different endings. So the example that we get, now by two different endings, I'm saying two different principal parts for this tense. So we have the verb prato, to do. And then this is going to split for its fourth principal part, the perfect active. And we'll either have first pepraga, and then the second is pepoitha. So both of these are going to be what we'll call strong aorists, even though this gamma here is pretty predictable given that it's prato, but this pepoitha is somewhat coming out of nowhere. And pepraga is, we remember we've seen prato used sometime with the prefix eo or either kakos to say, oh, they're faring well, they're faring poorly. This is to have fared. That's the difference here. But we've also had it more on the, we've had the verb mean to do as well. So when we have pepoitha, that's exactly what we're going to see. I to have, or I have, I guess is really what we should be saying here, because these are conjugated first person singular verbs. I have fared, I have done. Well, I have just screwed this up entirely from looking. I wondered what was going on there. Pepraga was our first one. So that is I have fared, but what I meant to say is here, pepraka. Sorry for the confusion, everyone. Hopefully you were following along in the book and we're not confused at all. This is the, we can see gamma 1, and this is an aspirated gamma, a guttural ch, and this is I have done. So we're going to get some nuances like this, and that's also the case with patho, which is where I looked at the wrong line as I was kind of going over the lesson. We've got pep beka, which is the I have persuaded. But note, remember, patho had the kind of strange middle pathomai, which is persuade myself to do something, or persuade myself to obey someone. So we had the obey, and then here we're going to get something similar, pepoitha, not obey but trust. I have trusted. So that's a new kind of variance. You can be sure that Shelmerdine is going to be throwing things like I've trusted or I have fared into the English to Greek sentences. So we'll cross those bridges when we get there. But to recap this whole lesson, now that we've gone through, what we were talking about was the strong, perfect active. So we'll get to middles and passives soon. But this notion of strong we had already seen in the aorist, where the weak forms, which were the more common, had common markers. You would add a sigma, you would add an alpha in the aorist, versus the strong, which would often keep the vowel or the consonant in the verb, switch the vowels, and give a different ending. Here in the perfect system, we'll often keep the consonant or somehow slightly modify it, modify the vowel, but we'll keep this alpha ending. All these endings that you see on the far right column here are the same as the weak perfect, but what's key here, what's making all of this strong, the reason why we have a separate lesson for this, is the change of stem, a kind of unpredictable change of stem. And then we had some verbs that fell into this category, and we looked at these two examples, prato and patho, that actually bifurcate by the time you get to the fourth principal part. They each have two fourth principal parts with slightly different meanings. I have fared versus I have done, and I have persuaded as opposed to I have trusted. In the next lesson, we'll talk a little bit about reduplication, what that means, and then get into the following video, the perfect middle, because we're going to see with some of these endings, it's not going to be easy with the strong perfect to tack on the middle passive endings that start with consonants. We'll cross that bridge when we get there too. See you then.